We will now look at the interface between the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of External Affairs and other parts of the government that contribute to the formation and the way in which policies are pursued. Mr. Saran, you have had again the advantage of serving in the Prime Minister's office both as a special envoy and prior to that you were the Foreign Secretary to the Government of India. Now, we are aware that there was a certain pattern in the way in which the earlier NDA government, when Mr. Vajpayee was the Prime Minister, when we had the creation of the role of the National Security Advisor, the NSA, the late Mr. Brijesh Mishra, for the first time. And we had a certain experience of how foreign policy was conducted in that particular period. Then we have the last 10 years of the UPA, where we had UPA 1, which had a certain coalition composition. And as it happens, we had the equivalent of two NSAs, the late Mr. Mani Dixit and Mr. Narendra, currently the Governor of West Bengal. And then we have UPA 2, which is the post-November 2008 after the Mumbai attacks. Now we've had Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, your colleague, as the National Security Advisor. There has been, I would say, a fair amount of commentary, and people have shared their thoughts about how this has worked. Now, you know all the players. I mean, in the sense that you were FS when Mr. Vajpayee was there, you were there with Dr. Manmohan Singh, both as FS, Foreign Secretary and the envoy. And now when you see the Modi government being formed and being sworn in very soon, there will be an NSA, be presumed. But what to your mind has been the equivalent of lessons learnt from the arrangement of a PMO, which either shaped foreign policy or which may have contributed in perhaps an excessive way in the formation of foreign policy?
Well, my experience is that most of the challenges that India is confronting today, and many more challenges that it will be confronting in the future, are very cross-sectoral and cross-cutting in nature. You can't really identify anything as a purely foreign policy issue. Even the Ministry of External Affairs has to carry several other arms of the government, several other ministries and agencies of the government for making its own foreign policy successful. So that's a very important new reality that we have to deal with. The second point that I would like to make is that in any government, coherence requires that the different arms of the government work together. Because if there are agencies of the government, including the Prime Minister's office, who are working at cross purposes with others, you're not going to get any effective policy. Where has the Prime Minister's office been actually helpful, been also effective in terms of foreign relations, is when it has played the role of actually knocking heads together of different ministries, where the Ministry of External Affairs itself might not be able to do that. So even if there is policy which is being determined by the External Affairs Ministry, because they have the expertise in foreign relations, how to make sure that this is orchestrated like a whole of government approach, only the Prime Minister's office can do that. Only the Prime Minister's office has the authority to actually knock heads together and make certain that after whatever debate has taken place, whatever discussion has taken place, there is a consensus policy which must be implemented, and it is the authority of the Prime Minister's office which also decides that it will be implemented.
But here again, if I could recall the experience of the last decade. Now, I will confine my own observation to the security foreign policy interface because I'm a little more familiar with that. Now, we are aware that definitely over the last 5 years, many of the initiatives that India wanted to pursue, particularly in relation to defense, military and the broader spectrum of security, which would be in the realm or the mandate of the Ministry of Defense. My sense, and I'm saying this purely as an outsider, somebody who reads the newspapers and gets some sense of what's happening in the government, that there was a dissonance, if I may put it that way, between the Ministry of Defense, between the Ministry of External Affairs and the Prime Minister's office. Now, this is where, again, now since you are the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board, is there something that we could do better? Because definitely if UPA 2 will be recalled, one would be a lack of coherence. That's your expression. So do you get a sense that we might be able to do it better?
As I mentioned, that the role of the Prime Minister's office could precisely be to reconcile somewhat different positions which may be taken by different ministries. You mentioned the Ministry of Defense having a certain approach to what, say, the Ministry of External Affairs would have liked to see happen. Take, for example, further cooperation on the defense side with, say, the United States of America, in terms of, say, maritime security cooperation between the two sides. Now, this is where, instead of being only a player in this debate, it is the job of the Prime Minister's office to reconcile those positions, make a decision as to what, in the view of the Prime Minister of the day, in the view of the Prime Minister's office, what is the right step to take. I think where we failed was that particular role of the PMO was not actually fully exploited. I would imagine that under a leadership of Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister's office will actually be a fairly powerful office, and therefore that particular role of reconciliation, that particular role of, as I said, knocking heads together and making certain that there is a coherent policy which is being pursued, this is something that we can look forward to.
Again, I would say that as a student of the higher defense management of India, it is something that I've been trying to study and understand for a fairly long time. There is a clear, I would say, pattern that has evolved, and I venture to say this aloud in public, and I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong, that the office of the NSA was created only after the nuclear tests. Well, let's put it this way, that with Mr. Vajpayee, we had the creation of the NSA, Mr. Brijesh Mishra, and he was concurrently also the PS to the Prime Minister. So I think in the parliamentary form that we have, there was a very distinctive kind of relationship between Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Mishra, who was wearing two hats. And again, I'm saying this based on the recall of those who were privy to some major decisions, that this was a very, very, I would say, confident relationship between the Prime Minister, his NSA, who in turn, as you said, was able to bring various heads. Whether he knocked them or not is a different point, but you could see a certain, I would say, clarity and a sense of purpose that the PMO brought. And this was not evident in UPA 1, and if I may say so, UPA 2. And this may have to do with the fact that, as we are now more familiar, that there was a division of the political authority and what you might call as the executive office of the Prime Minister and the office. You know more about that, and I will not, again, as I said, embarrass you to share detail that you may not want to. But the degree to which this will have an impact on neighborhood policy, because that is where the center-state relation is something which comes up, in terms of the visibility of the differences between, say, a West Bengal and a Delhi, or a Tamil Nadu and a Delhi. But perhaps in the next phase of the discussion, you could share your thoughts about India and its neighborhood policy, and what is it that we can expect from the new government. Ambassador Saran, we are talking about the neighborhood. Now, this is a region or an area that you know very well. I remember when you were FS, you had done, a survey, and you shared it with the public domain about the challenges for India in terms of the neighborhood policy. So it's almost 10 years. What can we expect?
Two things. One is, I think, a internalization of what I consider to be something which should actually be staring us in the face, which is, you cannot aspire to any meaningful role in the region or globally unless you get your neighborhood strategy right. That is, if you are constantly, held back because of crises which are taking place in your neighborhood, because of preoccupations with your neighborhood, how can you aspire to play that kind of a role? So this is something fundamental. I think successive governments have actually been engaged with the neighborhood what I call episodically. When the crises occur, they get engaged. When the crisis is over, then they lose
it goes off the radar.
Yes. So I think it is extremely important that we should have a neighborhood strategy which is based on constant, intense engagement with the neighborhood, because that is where your bread and butter is. That is really the nuts and bolts of your foreign or security policy. The second thing is, as you mentioned, that the states, the bordering states, play a very important role. Now, there has been some sense that over the recent years, states have become much more powerful, they have become much more autonomous, and therefore they are somehow hampering the pursuit of India's foreign relations, particularly with respect to neighboring states. I'm not quite sure that that is the case, because even in the past we have seen somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru was constantly in touch with the chief ministers of states.
And the famous letters he would read writing.
Exactly. So I think it is the nature of Indian democracy, its federal character, that you should try and take the states
with you,
who are stakeholders in your relationship with neighboring countries together with you. And I think, again, we have an opportunity to be able to do that. Naturally, we have to be able to convince the state governments involved that there is a certain benefit also to them if we have more secure borders, if we have greater economic interaction with our neighbors, connectivity with our neighbors. This is something which I cannot see how a state government can say this is not something that is worth their while. So, to put it briefly, I think whatever can be done in order to place our neighborhood policy right at the top of our list of priorities, the better it would be in terms of the future.
Ambassador Saran, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on a wide range of foreign and security policy issues with wide angle. Many challenges abound for the new government, and the Modi campaign had aroused huge expectations among the people of India. The cabinet formation process is currently underway, and very soon a new team will be in place. We can only wish them well in the protection and furtherance of India's abiding national interests. Thank you for watching. We'll be back on Friday at the same time. Till then, goodbye.
Narendra,